Okay, we're looking at chapter 3 of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, which is the chapter that actually deals with the title of the book, and the subject about which he actually wants to discuss in engaging with the issue of education theory, which is how he began the first chapter, a work entitled Men Without Chests, which, to recapitulate a little bit of what was said last time, when he's talking about chests, he's not talking about the physical entity. He's talking about what we associate with chests, which is the moral virtues. And so often described by philosophers and theologians as moral law. He wants to demonstrate that what he calls the Tao is not just a feature of a particular tradition, but is intrinsic to human nature. And to demonstrate that in chapter 2, which we're not going to look at, because each of the 3 chapters is too meaty, and I wanted to spend 2 lectures, not 3, on this, so I'll skip over 2, which is basically there to demonstrate, with respect to a wide variety of major religions, that they are largely in agreement on the moral nature of man. So they have certain prohibitions and certain requirements of people who live in a moral fashion, which is just suggesting that there is, what he maintains at the outset, a moral nature to man commonly recognized, and to which our generation of people now has become basically blind. They don't recognize something that previous generations would always have recognized, and without doubt, it's as indisputable as the laws of gravity. That certain, except probably more certain than the laws of gravity, because the laws of gravity are only lately come upon in the 18th century by Newton and so forth. Although we can observe the laws of gravity, things tend towards the Earth all the way back in ancient philosophy and so forth. But speaking of it as a law is a new thing. Whereas the law of human nature was always known by people in the education of their children, which is why they would forbid them to do certain things and encourage them, or in fact require them to do other things. You have to revere the gods. You have to honor your father and mother. You have to not steal, not lie, not kill. Those things are common. The idea of incest being abhorrent is cross-cultural. It's actually not even, I'm not even sure it's prohibited all over the place, because it's so basic that it's understood that it's absolutely abhorrent. It's there in Oedipus the King. And they don't argue to persuade you logically of something that you already know so intrinsically to the fiber of your being, that they simply assert that it is so. And with that in mind, they can then tell stories. And one of the problems I have teaching literature in universities is in teaching a generation that's been conditioned to ignore the moral law, because the moral law is a presupposition, a pattern in the world and the order of things that I need people to recognize before I can tell the story that a previous generation told. You have to recognize the reason he does this is because he realizes this is wrong. But if my audience doesn't recognize intuitively without explanation that it's wrong, then I have to explain that, at which point it seems a law that's out there, but it's not something that applies to you, and it seems culturally questionable. So that's the way they thought, but that's not the way I have to think. So I have to actually argue for something which is beyond contestation. And that makes it less persuasive. When you have to argue for something rather than just simply feel it, recognize it. It takes a long time for society to get to the point where we are now. Because Lewis is arguing in The Abolition of Man that in 1943, when he's delivering the lectures, that it's already the case that the schools, and by this he's talking about the sixth form, the public system of education, is implicitly and perhaps even explicitly rejecting moral values or moral laws. And he allows it to be called values, and he probably ought not to. He should stick to the word law that the Tao suggests. Because a value is something that can change over the course of time, and a law isn't. It's fixed, it's objective, it's real, it cannot change over the course of time. And so I think he does so just for the reason that Lewis is actually eminently reasonable, and he's always willing to entertain ideas even though he thinks that they're impossible, but he realizes other people don't, and so he'll be willing to entertain it as a possibility before debunking it and saying this is ridiculous. Like evolution. He thinks evolution is ridiculous. But he's willing to entertain it as a theory because that's what you do in the academy. You entertain ideas as theories. But I think Dr. Davis deals with that more in his class than I'm going to. I'll skim over the surface of that, although it's implicit here in the very discussion, because one of the issues at stake here is not only the nature of man, but also the nature of nature. The word nature is a disputable term. It's not clear what nature means, and if you go to, and I'm not going to study this in this course on C.S. Lewis, but if you look at his work, Studies in Words, which is as advertised, a study in words, he will give you the etymology of a variety of terms taken by somebody who has a vast, deep, historic understanding of how words are used in different contexts by different peoples. And nature is one of those. I believe it's entry number 2. And it's 50, 60 pages long. So if you think that nature is the green stuff, that the environment that we're trying to save, and has a quasi-sacred character, and we're desecrating nature, then you are the child of the Romantics that only emerged in the early 19th century. That is not the nature of nature, let alone the uncontestable definition of nature. And he will observe that. Have a look at Studies in Words, entry on nature, chapter 2. He will give you a long history of how nature was seen from the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, and on through the Middle Ages and so forth. And what that demonstrates is that nature is at least it requires us to define what we mean by nature and where we stand in relation to nature. We as human beings, are we a part of nature? Does nature determine us? Where do we stand in relation to nature? In Scripture, we're created on the 6th day. However, we're also made in the image of God, unlike all the other creatures. And God speaks to Adam, which he does not do to any of the other creatures. He speaks those things into being, but he does not address that entity which bears his image. And he does not command any other creature to exercise dominion over the others, but he does to man. So there's a hierarchy there in nature, and by virtue of the fact that man bears the image of God, that's what we can imply or assume is the reason for it. In which case, we are to exercise stewardship over the earth. In which case, man's presence on the earth is not inherently a desecration, which if you listen to environmental activists at our day, we want to reduce the number of people on the earth because it's desecrating nature, etc., is a really presumptuous argument. It presupposes certain things about human nature and presupposes certain things about the nature of the earth, as if the earth would do well without mankind's superintendence. If we just let things go wild and return wild animals to the pool of the local environment, then things would go well. If we stopped cutting back the forests where the undergrowth has died, then and let it just go wild, then nature will be better. Well, we have 30, 40 years of environmental policy where we have now rampant forest fires because they've not cleared the underbrush, which is just forestry management. We've stopped doing that because we want to let nature be natural. And as I say, it begs the question of what you mean by nature. It's always question begging. The reason nobody raises the question is because nobody has an education anymore or questions what we mean by terms. It's regarded as being quarrelsome. People get very upset. What do you mean by that? As soon as you ask the question, They get immediately uptight, think you're attacking them, whereas actually you're just saying, I want to know what you're talking about before we can proceed to the next term. So philosophers are happy to do this, and academics at one point were happy to do this as well. Now we no longer are willing to do so in the academy even. Which is why it's important in Tyndale's mission statement that it says, right first line, we're dedicated to the pursuit of truth, which you often, in fact, almost never hear from Tyndale. Although it's in our mission statement, which we cite regularly, we cite the service of the church in the world for the glory of God, but not the fact that we're dedicated to the pursuit of truth, although it is line 1, which means that it governs the rest of it. Anyway, what Lewis is addressing in the Abolition of Man as a bigger picture then is not just the educational philosophy of the conditioners, it's the contemporary situation of his day that remains the case in our day. So it is now how many years? 80 years and 1 after that lecture was delivered, so it's 2024 here. He observes not just a law of logic, but a law of history, that every civilization in history, and this is what becomes plain in chapter 2, every civilization in history has had a religious base. That's part of the Tao as well. He's appealing not to just moral law, but religious understandings. Every civilization in history has had a religious base. And ours is experimenting with a deviation from history's most obvious and universal law and seeing what's going to happen. So in some countries, atheism is the official position. And some just simply assert that it's a goal and we're going to conform to that fact. But this is an experimental condition, and the experiment is being enacted on those who are the subjects of the experiment in that particular country. And if there's a global organization that's going to promote the same thing, then it's a global experiment. And what it's doing actually is that it is, if we are biblically illiterate at all, which we're not, I will say, when I say we, I don't mean people in the room, but a generation, they're totally biblically illiterate. We are doing what in the Old Testament is quite plain, that a nation's fate depends on its faith. That's what we're engaging in. And we're suggesting that without faith, our fate will be better. And no nation has ever governed itself that way. And you might say, and I regularly say, it's not even true that we don't worship anything in our day. The people that call themselves atheists worship money, sex, and power. So Mammon and Ashtoreth and power, who knows? All of them are involved in power. Baal. The Old Testament gods, the very Old Testament gods, which seem to refer to them seems atavistic. You're talking about things in the past, we don't do that anymore. I think, really? Pornography is rampant. Moloch worship is the sacrifice of the newborn. Do we not do that, a version of that in the abortion debates, and see it as an absolute, ungovernable requirement? So we are, in the Abolition of Man, we are right in the crosshairs of the Old Testament conviction that if a nation departs from its faith, its fate will be dire. And it demonstrates it repeatedly. But there's only one thing stupider than that, and it's that's for religious people to abandon the tenets of religion, which they also have. That's theological modernism. They reject the miracles. Religious studies departments think that we can dispute whether miracles happened. Christ's divinity, the resurrection, heaven and hell, second coming, divine inspiration of Scripture, these are regarded as contestable, and we're going to stand above the fray and determine whether we think that we can hold to it or not. Like, these are beyond contestation, but they are precisely the things that theological modernism says is absurd and undemonstrable. So they want empirical proof of a miracle, which by definition is not a constant. But anyway, Professor Davis will be talking about this in his Lewis's study in miracles. And so then we have a problem here. If we do abandon man, and I'm going to get to this, because it's not just abandoning the moral law. That Lewis's title is very specific and very clear. It's not the abolition of the moral law. So I've heard people and read people say, this is a treatise about the moral law. And it begins with that. We get rid of the moral law. But it does not conclude with the abolition of the moral law. It concludes with the abolition of man. And he means that very specifically. We are abolishing human beings. That is, and in chapter 3, I'm going to argue exactly that. That's exactly the consequence of this. If we get rid of the Tao, if we get rid of the notion of the moral law, we will also get rid of humanity itself. And what will come in its place? The argument is basically there are two ways that you can answer the question that Lewis poses in The Abolition of Man, which is, how do we govern people? And the one is through the Tao, and the other is through socialism. That's the only two ways that have ever been proposed to govern people. We can either appeal to the moral law in its iterations, various religious expressions. We can do it that way. And then we can dispute, of course, which of the religions is the true religion. But at least all the religions understand that there is a moral law, and we have a moral nature, and we need to conform to certain patterns and so forth. So among the religions, there's enormous disagreement, but not as much disagreement as between our contemporaries that don't think there is a moral law at all, and all those others. Now, they chiefly attack Christianity, by the way, because Christianity has a different claim and character and, quite frankly, conformity to reality that the others don't, which is historically demonstrable. But it's not my place to do that here. But only socialism and religion have tried to address the education of humanity. And so then we get into the problem of the controllers versus the controlled, and the conditioners versus the conditioned. And so it's an extraordinary argument that ends up with this, that man's conquest of nature without the Tao must necessarily becomes nature's conquest of man. We appeal to nature, but what we mean by that is the elimination of man. That's the effect of the abolition of the moral law, is the abolition of human nature and human beings altogether. So it's annihilationist. When I say annihilationist, they'll first have to get rid of the definition of human nature altogether, and everything that goes with it. And all the things attributed to human nature in the Western world would have been defined by Christianity. All those definitions are going to go. And I'll come later on to the admirable Peter Kreeft's 33 things he says that went with it. He says there's probably a lot more than that, but there's a whole list of them. I'll read the list because I thought it was interesting. I thought, yes, all those things are no longer with us as a consequence of the abolition of man. And we miss them dearly. And we long and pine for the times when things like that. But the chief of them, or the summary of them, was presented by B.F. Skinner in that work I talked about in 1971, which he said was particularly directed at C.S. Lewis, the defender of the literatures of freedom and virtue. And the book's called Beyond Freedom and Virtue. And he is a conditioner. I mean, even in the discipline of psychology, he's known by that theory, classical conditioning. And so what's at stake here is not just religious, but it's existential, if you will. This is why this work that Lewis writes seems so powerful, to this very day. The stakes have not changed, and the discussion points have not changed. And the only question is within the camp of those who recognize that what's at stake is freedom and virtue, whether we think the most important thing is the freedom or whether we think the most important thing is the virtue. Where are we going to place the defense? Libertarians will place the defense on freedom. Lewis and the whole of every tradition, every religious point of view will say, no, it begins with the defense of morality, objective morality. Because we have to govern people somehow. We can't have a libertarian society in which there are no rules whatsoever. Everyone is free to do what they want in their own eyes. Well, then how would we adjudicate whether something was right or wrong? Would we, if somebody violated it, would we kill them ourselves? Take justice in our hands? Like, where would the justice system arise, and on what basis would it judge? There are laws. Well, you're appealing. The laws are the very thing that freedom is not going to say is objective anymore. In the name of freedom, he's going to push it to an absurdity. So you can tell where I stand on this. But as he says here right at the outset, man's conquest of nature is an expression often used to describe the progress of applied science. Man has nature whacked, as someone, sorry, I have to look behind me because this isn't working in front of me. Said someone to a friend of mine not long ago, in their context, the words had a certain tragic beauty, for the speaker was dying of tuberculosis. No matter, he said, I know I'm one of the casualties. Of course, there are casualties on the winning as well as on the losing side, but that doesn't alter the fact that it is winning. It being man, and a sort of an abstract entity in reference to the entire human race, which is making progress, in the face of which an individual is an irrelevance. We're going to find next semester, when we look at the science fiction trilogy in particular, Lewis is going to argue the moral significance of every individual life, in the face of which the appeal to progress must fall silent. It's more of more moment, and he will get this straight out of Scripture. What matters if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Right? Which, in the great play by Robert Bolt, A Man for All Seasons, is the Moore's retort to Sir Richard Rich. Great name. He was done it for money. He's got the vestiges of office around him. He's climbed very quickly, but he's done so at the cost of his own soul. And Moore is defending a certain position on the basis of conscience and conviction. But that's the issue. What Moore articulates in that play is what Christians have held historically, that the individual conscience is worth defending, and in that they will also find themselves in step with the Greco-Roman world, where people would also be willing to die for their country, because their country represented those virtues, and they lived a virtuous life, and therefore it was bigger than themselves. Yes, but their individual life still mattered. That's the very thing we were defending. But he uses three examples here. He uses the wireless. At this point, we would move to a more contemporary technological illustration, a cell phone. A wireless is a means of telecommunication. The wireless, the airplane, and the contraception show that some men wield the newly won power over others as its patients. That's his argument here. It will become particularly clear. So there it is, the airplane, the wireless, and the contraceptive. And he says, in a civilized community, in peacetime, anyone who can pay for them may use these things. But it cannot strictly be said that when he does so, he is exercising his own proper or individual power over nature. If I pay you to carry me, I'm not therefore myself a strong man. Now, you've got the power of your cell phone, but that doesn't make you powerful. I'm paying the service provider for the phone for a certain power. It doesn't make me powerful. It gives me a power that can be taken away from me. can be shut down, it can be blocked, it can be regulated in some way, it can be censored. Anyway, it's not a part of my proper human nature, which you wouldn't know based on habits where people are glued to it and it looks like it's part of their face. You wouldn't know that. But he says here, any or all of the three things I mentioned can be withheld from some men, by other men, by those who sell, or those who allow the sale, or those who own the sources of production, or those who make the goods. What we call man's power is in reality a power possessed by some men, which they may or may not allow other men to profit by. Again, as respect to the powers manifest in the airplane or the wireless, man is as much the patient or the subject as the possessor, since he's the target both for bombs and for propaganda. And the most powerful of them all is actually contraception, which you would not think would necessarily be the case. But in the case of contraception, you're preventing a future generation from even coming into existence, which is not a power over the present or a power over the past, it's power over the future. It's a very different sort of power. Some people think that the most heinous development of the 20th century was the development of birth control. For that reason, most people think that's a very extreme position. I think it is, but if you understand what's actually going on, you're preventing the future from happening. You're taking control of it. You're exercising your right bodily autonomy, etc. And yes, you are, but you're not only determining your own future, you're determining future generations in the process. This is a power that has never existed before en masse, and it has a purpose as well. He says, with regards to contraceptives, there's a paradoxical negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. By contraception, simply, they are denied existence. Used as a means of selective breeding, they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer. From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. So we use nature as a tool now. Becomes a little bit more obvious if you're not using, if you're using chemicals as opposed to a condom or something like something. That's hard to see that as nature, although it depends on your definition of nature again. Whereas if it's something, a biochemical thing, you say, oh yeah, that's a type of nature, and you're using it. But the point is you're using nature as a tool over other men. You don't acknowledge their existence. Well, that's because you don't see them yet. Still, they're there. So in each of the three illustrations, the airplane, the wireless, the contraception, some men wield the newly won power over others as its patients, and perhaps they're willing patients if they're on the airplane or using the wireless. But they are still patients, is his point. And patience means that you suffer the action. From the Latin, patient is from passive. From the passion of the Christ, he suffers the action done to him. The passive voice in grammar, you suffer the action. The active voice is I hit you. The passive voice is you are hit. Right? You suffer the action. We're the patients of it, of somebody else's action. And this has already dehumanized us. Because to be made in the image of God is to have an active role in the created order. And you've actually given up that by using certain technology to give you power. And you've actually, yes, you're giving it to other men, but you're actually giving it in some ways over to nature, which is supposed to be distinct from you. You're dehumanizing yourself. One of the illustrations I give for this is in class when I ask students some random question, does anyone know this? And I see people do a quick search on the internet and give me the answer. And I said, no, I didn't ask you if you could find it on the internet. I asked you if you knew the answer, which means it was in your mind, as in you memorized certain facts, you knew certain things. And the answer is they don't, because they had to search for it. I wasn't asking you because I don't know the answer. I was asking you to find out if you knew, and I know you don't know. which wasn't to humiliate you, it was to point out you need to know this in order to make the next step. You have to know this. That's hence the question. It's not, can somebody help me because I don't know anything and I don't have a phone with me or a computer where I could do the search just as well. But when I did the search, how would I know that what is given to me is actually true and not just what somebody's slapped up there who's just as ignorant as me? I would have no way of determining that if I didn't know something beforehand. And hence the problem with internet searches. And there's this thing called knowledge and wisdom and virtue, and you're required to have it, not appeal to it. You have to have it. And you get it by actually knowing it and walking in that path and having the wisdom to wield it. And the device that you're using gives you the power that has not come from the exercise of freedom and virtue. It's come from just possessing an entity. So you have a superpower. You can see people on the other side of the planet and speak to them. It's literally like a superpower. But does that mean you're a superior human being? Well, you think it does because you have that power. But do you actually have it in your nature? And the answer is no. Well, if you do that in a multiple of ways, what you never develop is the capacity to see anything, or to use a different analogy, to be able to run quickly. Like you can play a video game online, but you never actually learn to run or play soccer, play FIFA online, but you don't actually learn to play the game yourself because you've never developed the muscles. That analogy of muscles can be also applied to virtues. You never become a virtuous person. You're entertained, but you're not better. You're not improving yourself. And the thing that you're here to do is improve yourself. And the aid that you're using is actually preventing you from being self-standing. It's actually preventing you. You never develop the organ, the muscle, the virtue that you would have without it. Because you're going to have to deal with suffering and pain, and you want to avoid that, and this allows you to do it, and you think that's helping you, and actually it's preventing you from ever developing an ability to resist suffering and deal with it. Anyway, but as long as they're both the agents in the patience of those power over nature, then as long as they are, then they'll probably work within a common Tao. So there's stage one here. He's talking about, to some degree, what's the consequence of the abolition of man. And at first, he says, what is true, I think, at first, and we can observe this in the 20th century, at first people are going to agree that marriage is between a man and a woman, whether they're Christians or not. They're going to say that it is. And this is a male and this is a female. We're not going to dispute those terms. We're going to appeal to the idea of right and wrong. We're going to say murder is wrong. We're going to say adultery is wrong. We're going to say stealing is wrong. That's within the common Tao. The conditioners and the conditioned will all agree on that. That's stage one. But as time goes by, the conditioners gain power, and those that are conditioned lose their virtue in the exercise. And it becomes more and more of an unequal bargain. And those who have the power are unwilling to submit themselves to the idea of a moral law because they think they're above it. And those that are under that power think they're unworthy of it. They're willing to allow themselves, as long as they're given bread and circuses, they're willing to not revolt against what is being done to them. They'll allow themselves to be deprived of liberties, as long as they get enough pornography and gambling and food. And if it's tasty junk food, even better. It's sweet. Doesn't nourish them. Doesn't matter. And they'll ask for more and more conditioning, which means more and more government. Because again, I said there's two ways to solve the problem of human nature. You can either appeal to the law, the moral law, the Tao, which religious beliefs all engage with, or you can give yourself over to more and more socialism, and that's inevitably the path that we're going to choose if we deny the moral law. We're going to go down I want the government to intercede and involve itself more in my life to solve the problems I have in living, and I become less and less equipped to live on my own autonomously, as the government grows in its reach and extent and power. And the solution to this problem is more government and more control and then less power. I become more and more passive. This will be the true of all governments, even if you're a monarchist. Monarchy, which sounds like the power of the king over everyone else, is not oppressive if they operate under a common law. And then the king himself is under the common law. Right? Because the law applies to everyone. That's what the common law tradition is in English. The king is not above the law. The prime minister is not above the law. We have a common view of human nature. We all share it. And we're under that law and we're moving towards a common goal together. That it's not oppressive. It's a debate whether it's better to be a Republican or a monarchist or a Democrat. But as long as we share the idea of the moral law governing all those things, all of those systems can theoretically function. And then it's a question of which one does it best. But it's still the case. But if the power elite, whoever they are, whether it's a tyrant or a dictator or a king, or the majority who votes and wins the election, or the media elite decides that they don't believe in the Tao, in the objective moral law, then they become the controllers and the conditioners and the social engineers, and the rest of us become the patients of their power, and we're controlled by them. And so, as he put it in chapter 1, propaganda replaces propagation. Note that he's not talking about the Nazis as propagandists, although he's clearly talking about the Nazis. That's the Second World War. Everyone knows that the Nazis are enacting propaganda. There's a lot of discussion about this even in the 1930s. Bernays has written a book on it, 1932 maybe, propaganda. Pre-exists the Second World War. Mass conditioning techniques used in the advertising industry and so forth. So I'll go back to what I said at the conclusion of last time. Propaganda replaces propagation. Propagation he defined as old birds teaching young birds to fly. Doing what they do. Because they're all birds. This is how you fly. And I'll show you by flying. Whereas propaganda is programming parrots to repeat after me. Do as I say, not as I do. Propagation is transmitting a tradition as well, because we're social beings, unlike many of the animals. We're social beings, and we're also historical beings. The Christian religion, as opposed to the Eastern religions that he talks about, have a sense of the meaning and purpose of human history. Remember, I talked about history being one of the implications of the things that Lewis talked about. In the Christian faith, tradition is a relation to history, to our forebears, and also to the future. It has an eschatology and a teleology, for that matter. We think that history matters. That means individual lives in history matter. When you study history, you're studying the significance and meaning of events as they occurred in the past, but they have implications on the present, because we think that what happens in space and time by individuals who bear the image of God is always a significant issue. If you don't think that human beings bear the image of God, then history is an irrelevant discipline. Which is why history departments are folding all over the place, including in Christian institutions. And why would that be? Well, because, again, churches have lost the significance of the importance of history. It's a downstream consequence of the abolition of man. So propagation is the transmission of tradition, whereas propaganda is the invention of innovation. The newest thing, the newest iPhone, is the way in which we make progress. And it's the determining marker of progress further. The way in which we demonstrate that we're superior to those in the past is to say we have better devices. That's it. It's the mark of, but note they think it's human progress, where it's not human progress at all. It's technological progress, which might demonstrate a human superiority, but it's not, it doesn't go with it. You'd have to make the case that it does. And then it would beg the question of, well, how would we judge whether we, human beings, had advanced by the advancement of technology? Well, we would have to get into what human nature is. It's begging the question. I don't think we are better. In fact, I think we're a lot worse. And Lewis argues the same. But he will also say, and I tend to agree, it's not because people are morally worse than they were in the past. It's because they're deserts. There's just nothing there. They've lost all moral character. People complain that kids are not tough anymore. They're easily triggered, they're hypersensitive, they can't deal with language that they don't like. They get, say trigger warnings. I'm going to say something you don't like here, kids. Why are they so sensitive, so hypersensitive? Well, they've been conditioned to be hypersensitive. Because again, the conditioners can use that to push for more regulation and more intervention, which only makes the problem worse. But people will demand these things. Help me. I'm suffering. But that's stage one. If stage one is that both the ruled and the rulers will recognize the Tao temporarily because that's the way they grew up, that's not going to last. Stage two is when the Taoist conditioners will be motivated by their own social conditioning, first of all, because they think that all conditioning is absolute. It applies to themselves as well. They'll say that they're motivated or conditioned by their own conditioning, but never by the Tao. At which point they will walk away from the Tao altogether. Because the power that they get from conditioning others starts to go to their heads, and they see themselves as gods beyond the Tao. In which case they'll say something like, Protagoras was said to have said, I don't think he meant it in this way, that man is the measure of all things. Protagoras certainly didn't mean it as in, I am the measure of all things. That's modern subjectivism speaking. But that's what we'll mean by it. We determine what good and evil are. Like Adam and Eve in the garden. Rebellion against the commandment is not just taking a piece of fruit. It's a story that illustrates a rebellion against the governance of God. I will be as gods. Yes.
So then, this the idea of this is my truth and this
Yep.
is my reality.
Yep.
That would be an example.
Of course.
Going beyond the Tao.
Yes.
And using yourself as the moral.
And appealing to a concept of truth which is inherently subjective when you say that. This is my truth, which suggests that there can be something other than my truth. And so truth is not truth, it's a subjective state which I want to assert objectively and want that to govern my whole social relations. And then we'll get into some sort of uneasy agreement that you can have your truth and we'll all have our own truths and that will somehow work. Which is already giving way to the conditioners, of course, who deny that there is such a thing as the Tao. So you don't want to play that game. Either it's true or it's not true. If it's only true for you, then it's not true. If it's only true for you, it needs to be objectively true and subjectively true. The discipline of psychology, by the way, believes in subjective truth, just not in objective truth. Which is why we're in the dilemma we're in. To some degree, psychology now rules the disciplines. Which is why in a court, a psychologist's testimony trumps everything. It's extraordinary. It does appeal, at least it appeals to some sort of truth though, right? There's no truth, subjective truth there is. But Lewis is talking about subjective and objective truth. Anyway, So these Taoist conditioners will themselves be motivated by their own social engineering, but not the Tao. And the result of that is that they will be motivated by their own natural impulses. So go back to the beginning, we've got nature whacked, but what they'll appeal to their natural impulses. Well, which natural impulses? Heredity, environment, especially their environment, and especially fashionable opinions. This means they'll be motivated by nature, not by something that is permanent and objective, but nature as understood by the social elite, who have just defined human nature, and to use an illustration that's pretty obvious, that will include different genders and so forth, and not just male and female. Who determined that there are all these identities? Well, people subjectively profess that this is their identity, and then the conditioners said, yes, that's an identity, we need to acknowledge it. How could you come to that judgment that that was an identity that had objective reality? Even if you're in a position of authority, how did you come to determine that this was valid and legitimate? That's a subjective decision on your part to do that, to make that declaration that we have to do that, and then to put it into law. Again, it's trying to give an authorization of a state of subjectivity that is limitless, in which the outcome must be anarchy. And yet we're going to rule it, create laws to make it a requirement. So man's conquest of nature, which is at the outset of this snippet, man's conquest of nature gets expanded at both ends. Now, this is the key part of Lewis's argument. The conquerors themselves, conquered by nature, which is an environment without the Tao, are in turn in the position that they use nature to conquer other men. So they're first of all conquered by nature without the Tao, and then they use nature to conquer other men. So we use natural, that is Taoless or moralityless things to further conquer. And in the process, all of humanity is annihilated. So when Nietzsche speaks of the death of God, and I noticed that Jordan Peterson's, with his new online university, has talked about Nietzsche, and he's put out the first course is Nietzsche and the profundity of Nietzsche. That statement, the death of God, predates Nietzsche, by the way, significantly. And he doesn't even mean it the way it's being understood. What I think he means by the death of God is the death of objectively verifiable moral statements, the Tao. So it's not Nietzsche that's the profound thinker. Nietzsche is declaring something that long antedated him. And going back to Nietzsche is not going to solve the problem of the abolition of man, because he's lamenting the abolition of man, or, if you prefer, as Nietzsche will say, rejoicing in the abolition of man. You're not going to get a humanities education with the beginning point being acknowledging the abolition of man. That's not going to get you there. You have to go to a great tradition of moral value and worth, which will understand the objective status of human beings bearing the image of God, which is declared in the Western world through Christianity. That's how you're going to get it. You're not going to get it by doing Jordan Peterson's self-authoring Nietzschean quasi-Jungian psychological readings of Scripture. It's not getting you anywhere. That's just subjective. A subjective way of saying that Scripture is truthful. And that is not the way Scripture presents itself even. At which point then it becomes, you say, well, this is not a scriptural way of reading Scripture, and it's not even an objectively verifiable way of reading Scripture. It's to say this is a false way of reading Scripture then. other than personally, subjectively. You can say it's your truth, that's fine, but it doesn't mean that it holds for everybody. And it's pretty much that all religions assert a morally objective, verifiable state. And Scripture will say it's true of all human nature, furthermore. Anyway, so the conditioners will only use nature to conquer other men, and that's why man's conquest of nature turns out to be nature's conquest of man. Man's triumph is man's abolition. For the new man is not a man at all, he's an artifact, and he's an artifact of the making of the other conditioners. And so you can, with that artifact, do whatever you want. You can become a furry. You can chop pieces off. You can add other things. You're an artifact. You're not a person anymore. You're not even a man anymore. You're a new entity. We're going to come up with a new name for you. We're going to have to rewrite family law to get rid of father and mother, which, as we've done in Ontario. Father and mother are no longer in family law. You can have up to 4 parents. What they mean by parent is just an adult that has some sort of supervision over the child. But you can have up to 4 at one time. You can change the 4, but like why 4? It seems totally arbitrary to me anyway, probably just because it's such a crazy idea that if it can be an infinite number, people might say that's a little extreme. But the extremity is in getting rid of the concept of father and mother in relation to the family as part of the definition of a family, of course. But those who've been conditioned out of the belief in free will lose their free will. And in our days, the importance of freedom is being denied to us as important everywhere. It's never defended as this is an absolute reality and requirement for human beings. We require the freedom of speech, we require the freedom of religion, we have the freedom to assemble, etc., etc. So those who believe they're only clever apes, or as Lewis calls them, trousered apes, which he will portray in The Last Battle, shift the ape that puts on trousers and speaks. He's actually, he's not talking about an ape there, he's talking about the conditioners. That's a jab at them. If you didn't read it at the time, that's what he's doing, because he calls them trousered ape, and then what does he do? He portrays a trousered ape in The Last Battle. So those they believe that they're only clever apes become only clever apes. That's what they become. That's how they see themselves. And they'll say that we're dignifying the animal world, particularly the apes, by seeing ourselves just as an extension of them. But are we actually, by reducing ourselves to their level, lifting them up? And the answer that Lewis clearly supplies is we do not bring them up, we simply bring ourselves down. So equality, as in we're all animals, just removes the imago Dei from human nature and thereby kills man as man. So socialism, in the absence of a religious answer, and I'm going to give you a religious answer, obviously, and Lewis is more to the point going to give you a religious answer because that's throughout the course. We're going to look at Lewis's response to modernity, his contemporaries, the Taoist conditioners. He's speaking back against that. He's going to say that if you don't observe the Tao, then you will inevitably move in the direction of socialism, and socialism gets what it wants by an appeal to equality, through Bulverism, if you want to read that paper, through an appeal to equality. And they'll say that by appealing to equality, we'll get rid of oppression. But it's as if they had not read any history, and that's probably because they haven't. But egalitarianism can be as oppressive as any tyranny. And it is. In fact, it's more when it's pursued without any alternative. And de Tocqueville, the great French commentator on American politics, observed that democratic totalitarianism totalitarianism is not a contradiction in terms. Because they're not opposite. So democracy and totalitarianism are not different answers to the same question. They're different answers to different questions. Democracy's the question of to whom or who possesses the power. The demos, the people. But who possesses the power? The demos. Democracy is the answer. The krasi, the power of the demos. Autocracy is the rule of the autocrat. Whereas totalitarianism is an answer to the question, how much power should the authorities have? How much? Who possesses it and how much? Very different questions. You can put them two together. How much power should the people have? All of it. Should be no limits. And once they do work together, and they do work together, then the power to reshape human life, human thought, and human nature itself is limitless. And we're all going to agree to it. Why do we all agree to it? Because we're given the goodies to induce us to do it. And if you want a novelistic depiction of this, read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Because that's what's portrayed there. People are willingly assenting to absolute conditioning, including neonatal conditioning. That's the realistic portrait. Again, he's writing that around the same time Lewis is writing his work. And he's not talking about Nazi Germany. He's talking about the consequence of conditioning beliefs and the governance of society in a just fashion. But only the Tao can ensure freedom. I'm going to argue this publicly in a couple months. I won't say this on camera, but the specifics of it. But I'm going to argue this in public. Only when we're bound to the idea of a higher nature can we conquer the lower aspects of our being, namely our animal instincts. And this is a point that Lewis makes, and I can't do it on the screen. I meant to, but again, I can't actually see my screen here, so I can't put it up there. But in the Phaedrus by Plato, he talks about the allegory of the chariot, and I stuck that up on our course website. And in the allegory of the chariot, he's talking about human nature and actually talking about education. And he makes the point that, and again, it's an allegory. And he says there's a charioteer, and the chariot is tethered to two horses, a white horse and a black horse. And the white horse tends to go upwards, and the black horse towards downwards. And the white towards the sun, and the black towards the earth. And he talks about the need to govern this, and the charioteer has the idea of the good in mind. And he wants to pursue it, just like Plato. The good, the true, the beautiful, that's the ideal. The charioteer has that in mind, and the white horse tends in that direction, and the black horse doesn't. And education becomes the governance of the black horse, which is the passions, by the charioteer who represents reason and uses the will to get there. So you have to control your own nature. So the nature being controlled is not nature out there, it's nature in here. You have to subdue the passions. You have to make them conform to reason, and therefore to truth and goodness and beauty. You have to rationally regard, first of all, you have to see what goodness, truth, and beauty are, and then you have to say, I'm going to pursue those things, even though my passions lead me in a different direction. And so when we appeal to nature, we've eliminated all distinctions between the two horses, the white and the black, first of all, and we say that all nature is nature, and therefore all things that we naturally desire are also good. Or we could say it in reverse, but although they never say this, they're all evil. Because we've eliminated the idea of good and evil, because those were part of the Tao, once again. So as I say, only the Tao can ensure freedom, because only when we're bound to a higher law of permanent, unchangeable, objective moral absolutes are we free from being determined by the lower laws of animal instincts, self-preservation. It's good and beautiful to die for your country. That doesn't make any sense unless we think that there is something superior to us for which we're willing to die. And the thing for which we're willing to die is for king and country, for God, for our families. It's something of greater worth than I am. And only conformity to the Tao, which is trans-social, it's above social determination, can we make non-conformity to a decadent society such as we're living in unjust. Only by conformity to that, or even possible. Because we have to conform to something. Human beings are, as Aristotle says, by nature, imitators. We imitate something. That's how we learn. And we conform to a certain pattern. What's the pattern we're going to conform to? Are you going to follow the mentor that Odysseus is led by? Are you going to follow the path of Jesus Christ, the Via Crucis? Is that the path? But there's a pattern for which a mentor, a role model, an ideal that you are conforming yourself towards, saying, I want to be like that, and not like that, I want to be like that. Or are we going to just simply be formless or invent our nature entirely? And I've said multiple times in almost every class I ever teach that for the last 200 years, the model of heroism is that of an orphan. And orphans have no role model or pattern. They don't have parents. They don't have authorities. They themselves are the authority of their own natures. And they will discover for themselves what they are to do. So even when they have a figure of wisdom speaking into their lives like Dumbledore will not be able to tell Harry Potter what he is to do there. Harry will have to find out for himself, because Harry somehow has survived, and he has a wisdom within him that even the wise Dumbledore has nothing to say to. So in other words, the child is the father of the man, as Wordsworth said. So we're going to conform to something, or we're formless. And if we're formless, again, if we're essentially formless, then that allows for plastic surgeries ad infinitum, which again benefits somebody. You might think it benefits you, but it doesn't. It benefits the people doing the plastic surgery. They make a lot of money off of it. You might be happy with the outcome temporarily, but it's still not power over yourself, because you beg the question, what do you mean by myself? You've changed your appearance, there's no doubt about that, but have you actually gained power over yourself? Is that possible without answering the question, what is a human being to begin with? People don't even ask the question, because again, that's a philosophical question, it's a theological question, it's a human question, and we're no longer humans. We're people with wills and appetites, but no reason. Everyone still has their passions. They still have their appetites. That's the lower part of our nature. We will not get rid of those things. We require our appetites to be fulfilled to survive. We have to eat, we have to drink. We require certain things. The Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, those sort of things are part of our nature. What's wrong about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs is that he suggests that the one is the basis for the other. In other words, these are more essential, whereas the more essential ones are at the top. Those are the more essential from the perspective of the Tao. And he thinks we only get to the Tao by being well fed. Well, that's because he's a socialist, implicitly. So I mentioned that Kreeft mentions 33 objectively permanent things that are lost, and subjectively speaking, and I'll just list them. Silence was regarded as a good thing. Solitude, detachment, self-control, contemplation, awe, humility, hierarchy, modesty, chastity, reverence, authority, obedience, tradition, honor, simplicity, loyalty, gentlemanliness, manliness, womanliness, propriety, ceremony, cosmic justice, pure passion, holy poverty, respect for old age, the positive spiritual use of suffering, gratitude, fidelity, real individuality, real community, courage, and absolute honesty, which is the absolute or fanatical love of truth for its own sake. That, and he says, of the 33, that's one lost value for each year of Christ's life. He just lists 33, could have gone on to more. He just wanted to 33, like the patterning of the 33. But all of those things are of no value in a Taoist world. And you can come about that through various ways. One of them is you can reject the differences between the sexes altogether and certain characteristics that go with it, which harms both men and women in different ways. And so you could spend time talking about that. That's not the purpose here. But those things are clear things that were valued, prized in the past, and are no longer valued or prized. And I think he's correct. Those things are not. Those have already been lost, he says. And if that's the case, then it's really difficult to live a virtuous life in our day, and a free life, because the people around you whom you're in social relations with, because to bear the image of God, by the way, is to have social relations and political relations. The people all around you who deny the Tao are at enmity with the very idea of the thing that's going to govern your life as a human being. Very, very difficult situation. How about the progress then? So he goes on to talk about progress. Well, there's two types of progress. There's material progress and then there's spiritual progress. Materially, we can point to progressive things in the world. The expansion of wealth and so forth, although that's currently being, the appeal to beggar ourselves is being made by the elites right now for the sake of the climate and nature. We're going to beggar ourselves. We're going to borrow more money that we can't pay, the debts load, etc. And we're going to do it for the sake of nature. I've already talked about begging the question of what we mean by that. And but that's the one means of progress, although, as I say, now regress is progress, which is the great irony of our day. We'll become poorer, and that's the way we're going to measure progress. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right? The WEF's statement. That you'll own nothing is a true statement, that you'll be happy is a false statement. But you will own nothing, we're definitely going that direction. You will be happy, no, there could be no greater falsehood. Double speak. But spiritual progress, I think there's only one area, and Kreeft mentions this, and I think he's right. There's only one area that we've made spiritual progress, and that's kindness ahead of cruelty. I think we're kinder than our ancestors were, in some ways. In some ways. We're kinder to criminals, we're kinder to heretics, we're kinder to foreigners, we're kinder to other races, we're kinder to the handicapped, towards mental health. We're kinder. So that's progress of sorts. The question is whether it offsets all the other ways in which we've regressed, for one thing, and then it also says in Scripture the compassion of the wicked is cruel. Whether the compassion which we show towards people that we used to be cruel towards is actually compassionate, because it's bringing them into a society in which the Tao doesn't govern life, and is that a better life for them? Is it actually, so you're materially benefiting, and people come to North America for material reasons, for the reasons of freedom and wealth. And when they get here, they find that the Tao doesn't govern life, and they say, hold on, what sort of world is this? Are you actually, by being kind to them, inducing them to be part of the conditioned people? And would they have, if they'd known that was the bargain at the beginning, would they ever have come? But I do think he's right, that we are more kind than in the past. And I think it's a real legitimate thing. I think people are kinder to animals. So the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals that emerged in the 19th century, it emerged for a reason, and mental health agencies and so forth, and awareness of like handicapped ramps into, places that would have been impossible to enter in a wheelchair. We have wheelchairs. So there's an awareness of the human frailty, and or even differences, and I think we're kinder towards other people, and let's say that's legitimate, because I think it is. But the question is, in terms of the other things, and we'll come to this later on in the course when we look at the four loves, kindness is familiarity, actually. It's just making everyone like a big family. What does it do with friendship? What does it do with eros? What does it do with agape love? It rejects agape love altogether. With eros, it means being kind to all sorts of different people who look different, and different types of expressions of eroticism, etc. Is that an advance, or is that a regression? And I'd say it's a regression, because it denies the Tao again. And human nature, which is to grow up in a family. Adam and Eve were to be fruitful and multiply. Before they were able to multiply, they had to first be fruitful, and then they had to raise the child to the point of being an adult. That's how it begins. But if you deny that sexual intimacy between one man and one woman is the normative, ethical thing to do, then that's going to create all sorts of downstream consequences that we read about in the Old Testament once again. Any comments or questions? I can't get through it all. I just wanted to give you but that's the argument, though, basically, is that nature's conquered man. The abolition of man is not just the abolition of the moral law. It's the abolition of man altogether as a category, as a thing, which is why I said that when I wrote my doctoral thesis, I realized that the central issue of our day is anthropology, human nature. What is it? What is human nature? Because the Tao has eradicated that as a central interest preoccupation for a reason, because we don't want that discussion. Because if we have to enter into that discussion, we're going to lose. The conditioners do not want you to have the discussion, what does it mean to be a human being? They don't want that. Because if you came to the conclusion it would be to have dignity and worth and have certain freedoms, then that's going to oppose conditioning. So let's not have that discussion. And that's not even a religious discussion. I can have that in the humanities. It is a religious topic, of course, and religions have better things to say about it, I think. But it is not strictly, as I say, it's an anthropological question. So there's the entry point. Have anthropological questions. What does it mean to be a human being? What's the best way for people to organize each other? Is the family part of the definition of human nature? I think it is. Is an individual personhood something of such value that Jesus will say that we can gain the whole world, but it's not worth losing our souls? That's what he says. And Christians have always held this, which is why they've defended people who are weaker than they. And the Christian call to charity exists as a great love, expression of agape love. Anyway, no questions. We're done for today. I'll see you next time.